The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, is 3 really a magic number? So I attended church regularly when I was a kid and a teenager. It slacked off a bit in my early 20s. I was in the Navy, but I don't remember very many of the sermons. And I mean, I was there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Wednesday night, and primarily by my own choice. I wasn't much of a morning person, but I went because my friends were there, because I cared about Jesus and I wanted to learn things. And I don't remember the specifics of very many sermons that I heard during that period of time, but there's one that has stuck with me in great detail for all these years. And while it's not something we frequently hear in the form that I heard it, we do hear about it in other senses. And that is this idea that 3 is a magic number. Now, in part, I think this was reinforced by Schoolhouse Rock. I loved Schoolhouse Rock Saturday mornings, and one of their animated songs was 3 is a magic number, and they went through some things. But the preacher had pointed out that there is this appearance of 3 recurring throughout nature, beginning with our own bodies and expanding out into the very fabric of the universe that we inhabit, and that these were representations of the Trinity, that essentially all of these were constantly proclaiming the truth of a triune God, that your fingers have 3 joints, and including your thumb. And then if you look at your arms have a hand, a forearm, and an upper arm. And your legs, you have feet and lower legs and upper legs. And your body seems to be divided into head and torso and legs. Your face has this appearance of 3 zones where your eyes are, your nose, and your mouth. When you look at the universe, you have space and time and matter, and space is height, width, and length. Time, past, present, and future. Matter, solid, liquid, gas. But is that actually accurate? I mean, we've already forgotten plasma with regard to matter. And, you know, I've heard examples of morning, noon, and night, how you need 3 legs in order to make a stable stool, how the triangle, the 3-sided triangle is a stable shape, and how all of this is supposed to tell us more about a triune God. But is that really the case? Are these things accurate? Are we cherry picking? Are we engaged in fallacies? And what message can we come up with? What information can we glean from these observations? Let's take a look. So it seems pretty reasonable that we do actually have some fascination, at least, with the number 3, or dividing things into 3. When you talk about film theory, you have different thirds of the screen, upper and lower thirds, and then how you're going to frame things. You know, I'm over on this side now, I'm going to be on this side, or I can be in the center. It's a fairly convenient way to divide things up. And it's also often considered an idea of sort of literary perfection, both with regard to structure and content. 3 Little Pigs, 3 Musketeers, 3 Men and a Baby. Well, maybe that one departs a little bit from that. But the interesting thing for me is that this fascination with numbers and meaning, which is often referred to as numerology. Also, gammatria is this idea of assigning a numerical value to letters and then figuring out what a particular word's value is. All of these things are all tied up in ancient mysticism. You see this in Kabbalah. But we have this desire to find the meaning behind the symbols, behind the numbers, behind the patterns that we see. And we're not stuck with only the number 3. For example, in doing a little bit of research for this site, I went out and looked around at what Christians of various types and theologians of other denominations had to say. And if you go to CARM.org, the Creation Apologetics Research Ministry it's evidently run by Matt Slick, you'll find an article for him that talks about biblical numerology. You can do a quick Google search for that. And they find, for example, they come up with the gematria name for Jesus in Greek is 888. Okay, cool. I mean, that's interesting. I don't exactly know what you're supposed to derive from it. And it doesn't seem that they do either. For example, they give each one of the base numbers a label. 1 is the number of unity. 2 is the number of division. 3 is the number of divine perfection. And I find that very interesting. They label 3 as the number of divine perfection. And yet when you skim down further on their list, when you get to number 10 is also the number of divine perfection. And so they give all kinds of examples for 3s, probably more than any. 4 is the number of creation, 5 is the number of grace. I don't know how they ended up determining this. All they do is give examples, saying there's, for this north, south, east, west, the 4 cardinal directions, and somehow that means that it's the number of creation. How did you determine that? None of this seems to have any basis in anything other than, I think this kind of should be considered the number of creation. Number 6 is the number of man. 7 is the number of spiritual perfection as opposed to divine perfection. 8 is a number of new beginnings. Why? Because on the 8th day is when you're circumcised. Well, yeah, I guess that's a new beginning. Somebody decided to cut off portions of somebody's genitals, and it's the 8th day, so it's a new beginning. Congratulations, your first 7 days you were intact. Beginning on the 8th day, you're not quite. 9's the number of judgment. 10's the divine perfection again. 12 is the number of governmental perfection. I think that's an oxymoron right out of the gate. Governmental perfection, really? 40 is the number of probation or trial. And then, so we skipped 11, and then we skipped everything from 12 to 40. And then we skipped from 40 all the way to 153. And the cool thing for me is, why 153? Well, the disciples caught that many fish. And fish, the gammatric number for fish is 1,224, which is 8 times 153. 153 fish times 8 equals 1224, which is fish. Now that brings us to a very interesting thing. At the end of that little discussion about the number 153, they say, and remember, Jesus is 888. Okay, but what does 888 have to do with 8 times 153? You just get to triple the number whenever it's convenient. Jesus is 888. We'll use 1/8 as a kind of a beginning approximation for Jesus. Multiply that times the number of fishies, and you end up with the gammatric number for fish, 1,224. So you can just pick out numbers. Like if Jesus is 888, wouldn't it need to be 888 times 153? Why do you get to just use 1/8? Now, finding significance in different numbers is easy. And it's particularly easy the lower the number is. You can find 1 in everywhere. The identity, any individual thing you identify is necessarily 1. So almost everything's going to have, you'll be able to find a 1 with it. Why all this fascination with the number 3 in the human body? After all, I've got 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 lungs. There's this bisymmetric symmetry where 2 seems to be a much better number. I have a front and a back. But you have front and a back and sides. Yes, but if you were to add that, there'd be a front, a back, a left side, and a right side. So that's 4, not 3. All of this depends on how you decide to divide things up. And the interesting thing for me is that 3 is where pattern recognition really starts in our minds. Something happens. Something happened. It happens again. Hey, wait a minute, that happened again. I wonder if there's a pattern. When it happens the 3rd time, that is when we begin to really recognize a pattern. Now, you may need more than that to figure out what the pattern actually is, as anybody who's taking one of those numeric sequence puzzles on an SAT test or IQ test can tell you. You need several of them in many cases to find out what's the next number in the sequence. So if you only have 2 or 3 numbers, you might not be able to correctly determine what the next one is. And yet somehow, we can look around and just see the prevalence of a number everywhere, and people have determined this is the number of creation, this is the number of divine perfection, and not only this is what the number means, but this is why it means that there's some divine being who is trying to convey information by planting patterns everywhere. Is there more to this? So as it turns out, there's actually a lot more to this. As we just finished talking about, evidently you can repeat a number or remove some numbers with no mathematical. I mean, there's nothing, maybe divide by 111 to go from 888 to 8. But you can also do mathematics with it. If you looked at your hand, there's 5 digits in the palm, that's 6, and that's 3 times 2, which would be the number of divine perfection times 2. So maybe my hand's twice as perfect. You can do this sort of manipulation. So the lower the number is, the easier it is to find examples. It's a little harder to find examples of 83,945 than it is to find examples for 2 or 3. And that's just because of the nature of the way numbers and patterns work, it's not necessarily that there's some divine message in all of this. But they don't even have to end with regular numbers. You could have irrational numbers. For example, 5. It's the golden ratio, the golden mean, 1.61803339, blah, 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 repeating. And it is essentially the ratio wherein a line is divided such at the point where the ratio of the medium-sized line to the larger line is the same as the ratio of the smaller line to the medium line. You see all kinds of structures where people will point out that this is used in buildings. It is our idea of perfect perfection. Within it is the golden spiral. And the best thing I can point you to, which I believe is available on YouTube, is to do a search for Donald in Mathmagic Land. It's a Disney cartoon that I loved as a kid and still love as an adult, although I have a couple of different issues with it. But Donald Duck essentially gets taught a number of lessons in mathematics. I love this section on billiards, but there's a whole section in there about the golden ratio, and it shows examples of it. What I find most interesting now is that not all those examples are actually accurate. I mean, you can find a tree that appears to break down along with the golden ratio, but you can also find trees that don't. And so there's an element of cherry picking here. There's an element of sharpshooter fallacy, where we are remembering the hits or picking the ones that fit and ignoring the misses or ignoring the ones that don't fit the pattern. So you can manipulate the numbers any way you want. You can say they mean pretty much whatever you want or whatever you think you can draw a line to. You can manipulate them mathematically. You don't have to stick with rational numbers. You could have 5, 1.618, blah, blah, blah. And then you can do what some have done, which is to say, okay, well, the Ark of the Covenant, if you look at the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, that was 2.5 by 1.5. And that ratio turns out to be 1.666666, repeating. And that's close enough to 1.61803, blah, 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 that they're going to count it as a hit. So we know that you can manipulate the numbers however you want. Just, you got 888, just drop 2 8s and use that one to do some math to get another number. The same sort of manipulation takes place, by the way, in the famous Bible codes that we hear about, or we heard about decades ago, although somebody recently called the show to proclaim them true once again. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that Hebrew, the letters were also numbers, and so that kind of synchronization between the two, or the dual meaning between the two, has encouraged a mindset that seeks to find dual meaning in these things. But if we can do it with anything that's close enough and we can manipulate the numbers, what can't we do? What are the rules for figuring out what these patterns mean? For example, there's a famous old song about a deck of cards, and I've seen it used in card tricks as well. If you look at a standard deck of cards, you have 4 suits, and they would say this would represent the 4 seasons. And you have within each suit 13 cards, which would represent the 13 lunar cycles. And 4 times 13, the entire deck equals 52 cards, and that would be equivalent to the 52 weeks of the year. The song continues on and makes the claim that there are 365 pips if you add up all the pips on the card. It turns out that's actually not true. I don't know if the person who wrote the song was just bad at math, or if they were using the same sort of manipulation that we find when digging through the Bible and holy books. But I guess if all you're going to do is run around and say, I found a 3 and a 3 and a 3 and a 3, and this tells me that the Trinity's there, then I almost find it more impressive that a deck of cards has 4 suits to match the 4 seasons, 13 cards to match the 13 lunar months, and that this ends up with 52 cards, which is the number of weeks in a year, even though weeks are potentially arbitrary. And so if we look at this, how many pips are actually on those cards? I mean, we don't have 365. We could get to 364 if we counted jacks, queens, and kings as 11, 12, and 13. But none of that matters, because you couldn't get to 365 with a deck divided into 4 suits. It would have to be a multiple of 4, or at least even. Even if you started counting the pips on the upper and lower corners, that's still 2 per card. So you can't get to an odd number. And none of that matters anyway, because there's actually 365 and a quarter days in a year. So we find significance in a deck of cards, or did we invent significance? Did we say, Ah, this is kind of like this, so let me draw a connection. And therein lies the rub. That is the problem with all of biblical numerology or numerology out in the world, whether you're messing with a deck of cards or looking for a code in the Bible. None of it makes any sense, and it seems there are no rules. You can do whatever you want. If there was a God out there who had a message for us, why would he go around hiding everything in threes? Why not just actually talk to people? And if he's going to talk to people, why wouldn't he actually talk to everybody and not just handpick a few people to relay messages that he knows they're going to get wrong? That doesn't make any sense. And if we're going to be looking for patterns, and our brains are pattern-seeking machines, it is in our best interest to find patterns, to recognize how things work. It's the pattern recognition that our brain does that allows us to make accurate predictions about what our actions are going to lead to. It is the pattern recognition parts of our brain that allows us to build protective mechanisms because we know landslides happen, we know avalanches happen, we know tornadoes happen, and they happen at this time of the year, and then we spot the weather patterns, and then we can tell a little bit more and a little bit more until we can begin to more accurately predict when and where a tornado is likely to strike. That's the way pattern recognition works. And it is a mechanism of probability, it is a mechanism of inference, and it is not a useful tool to some truth or hidden truth with respect to meaning. It's bad enough that we look and see patterns all over the place that aren't there. We're not terrible at it. We aren't so struck by every pattern that we see that we are incapable of living our lives. We do a pretty good job of weeding out the more important patterns, the ones that are most likely to represent some real pattern, some real trend, than we are about patterns that, might be trivial. And when you go out seeking a pattern, you're going to find one. If you are able to look at a pattern, manipulate different digits within it, arbitrarily, not mathematically, but just, hey, we're going to get rid of a couple digits here, we're going to add a digit here. If you're then able to also do mathematics along with it, we'll multiply this by this, and if you multiply that by that and add this, you get that. If we're then able to convert letters into numbers and back and forth, and do any of these, there's always going to be some way to find the pattern that fits. It's bad enough that you think you can draw a conclusion from that kind of processing. It's worse when we find out that the elements that you're choosing for your pattern are also cherry-picked. They are the sharpshooter fallacy. Let's pick things, it's not morning, noon, and night. There are a number of hours in the day. There's the time when the sun is shining, and there's the time when the sun isn't. When you are able to selectively say, oh, yes, of course, there's a 3 here, and ignore all the places where you don't have a 3. For example, I don't have 3 bones right here. We're gonna get rid of all those things that don't fit. That is cherry picking. That is the sharpshooter fallacy. And if your pattern that you're trying to draw meaning from, if your pattern can be manipulated, and if the elements of the pattern can be selectively chosen, you're not finding a pattern that was there. You're finding exactly what you went looking for.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.